Well, welcome to the Cut for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay. I'm joined by Eric Stearns, and today we're digging into my message from Sunday, some version of it, because Sunday was a little bit of a crazy service between cradle rocking and graduating seniors and third grade Bibles and Mother's Day. But we did talk on Sunday about voices. We talked about Jesus' voice and how we hear it and what that means for us as people of faith. So today we focused on just the ways that we hear Jesus' voice and just some of the details of the story from John's Gospel. Let's get into it.
Sounds good.
I wanted to talk more about, at the start of the week, more about how we do faith at different stages of life. You know, there's a time for Chi Alpha, there's a time for not Chi Alpha, but yet there's still always a time for some kind of small group something. You know, there's always time for a Bible study. There's never a time where we shouldn't be engaged in a Bible study. There is a time for reading a devotion that just kind of spoon feeds us, and there's a time for reading a devotion that really just, kicks us in the butt and asks us hard questions and makes us wrestle and think. There's a time for kind of what Paul says to the Corinthians. There's a time to be fed with milk, and then there's a time for steak. And I just could not wrestle with that. I just could not wrap a homiletical track around that. So I punted to... Actually this gospel text was the lectionary gospel text for the week. And so I started reading and I read some resources. It's just like, what does it mean? Jesus talks a lot, twice in the passage, he talks about his sheep knowing his voice. And so what are the voices we hear became kind of the guiding homiletical thought.
Interesting. So how often does that happen for you?
That drastically, seldom. But it was also just the week, because I just kind of had the yips because of, we had to rock 8 babies and celebrate 4 seniors, and it's Mother's Day, and we do third grade Bibles. We haven't done it yet. A Bible presentation will take a minute and a half, and then it's just like, okay, how do I wedge the sermon in here somewhere? And so just all of those things led to a real big shift this week.
Interesting. So you open the sermon with a story about your Brookings Church, a member of the Brookings Church. Is there any more to that story?
Yeah, so there is actually. So Pauline came, and she was in this place of just feeling really, really down and distraught because she did not know what not driving was going to mean for her when she equated so much of that with serving God. And so what was left for her to do? And there does come a time in our lives of faith where it does become someone else's turn, but there's really no retirement policy in the kingdom of God. And so what Pauline and I talked about was, okay, if it can't be that, what can you still do? If your kids aren't comfortable with you driving outside of Brookings is still a pretty good sized place. There's still a lot of options for you. You want to drive your friends to the clinic? Drive your friends to the clinic. It's going to be okay. And then so what else, where the conversation veered into is, what else can you do? Which is, well, I like to write. I was like, do you like to write cards or stories? Or what does that mean, you like to write? We dug into that a little bit further. And, she likes to write letters and stuff. I was like, do you know how many people in this church would be touched with a handwritten letter? And we've talked about, Brookings was a big enough church where it's not like here where we share our joys and concerns, but yet there was an apparatus in place where people could share with the church, you let the office know, we put it in the bulletin, we would announce it before we went into our prayer time, and she could write cards, write notes, write encouragements, and just, pick people at random and write a note and just say, hey, thinking of you today, praying for you, And that became a pretty big part of what she was doing.
That's cool.
It was kind of part of, we had a group through UMW called the Care Group. So she really came alongside of that ministry and really just kind of found her niche, found her place. She was hearing a voice that was telling her that she was useless, and she still had so much left to do. And I think that that's true of all of us. Like I talked about on Sunday, there are so many voices that just can bring us to a screeching halt. But yet Jesus says, my sheep know my voice. And Jesus always has something in store and something in mind for us to do.
Sometimes it's hard to identify what that is.
It sure can be. And that's why, that's why there are people in our lives that can help us have that conversation. Not just pastors, but not just pastors. There are friends and spouses and, people, mentors in the faith that we look up to, that we can just say, hey, I'm struggling with this. Can we talk about it? And more often than not, I'm just going to guess that people are going to say yes to that.
Yeah, even identifying what our skills are.
Yeah.
That can apply well in this, in moving the faith forward. That can be hard. Or it can be hard to accept what you're being called to do.
Sure.
It was hard for me to accept filling in and delivering the message on Sunday.
Yeah.
Really glad I do it, but it's not something that I expected I would enjoy or be good at,
Sure.
But I could tell that I was being called, and I finally said yes, and I'm glad I said yes.
Yes.
But stuff like that, it's never easy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
To identify or say yes to those things, because life is about being outside your comfort zone.
Right.
You don't get anywhere without being outside your comfort zone.
Yep.
Should we go into the scripture a little bit? Do you want to talk about the Hanukkah, how that all kind of works into this?
Sure, yeah. So John's gospel highlights the fact that this happens during the festival of dedication. The story of Hanukkah, I thought the story of Hanukkah happens earlier in the Old Testament, where Elisha is ministering. It's Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha is ministering, and there's enough oil in someone's lamp for 8 days. I thought that was the story of Hanukkah, and then I took a world religions course and found out that is not correct. So the story of the Old Testament basically ends with God promising not to give up on the Israelites. They are still in captivity, they are still in Babylon, but yet God has promised not to, abandon them. The New Testament opens with Jesus. The Jews are back in Jerusalem. They have set up this whole, what we talked about before, where they set up this whole series of laws so as to not break the actual law of God. There's a very organized hierarchy and structure that existed but didn't exist like this in the Old Testament. And so readers of Scripture maybe think, what happened? There's a little bit of fuzzy in the middle of that. The Persian Emperor Cyrus allows the people of God to move back to Israel. That happens that's kind of foretold in the book of Isaiah. But Cyrus comes into power, and he allows the people to go back and live in Israel, but still be under this captivity, still be under this rule. And so power has changed hands. The Israelites are living in the Holy Land, and then Antiochus Epiphanies becomes kind of the regional governor of the area. A family, the Maccabeans, revolt against him, and they are successful. They are successful in throwing off their captors for a while before the Romans come in, and they are an independent nation for a while, which was their whole goal. It's their whole thing. That's why the Jews were looking for such a political Messiah, because this revolt was successful, and they tasted independence for just a second again. And part of what they were doing with their independence was reestablishing the temple, reestablishing themselves as God's chosen people, as a royal priesthood, as a holy nation, all of these things that they were under King David. And so the ritual to rededicate the temple was set to take 8 days. but they only had oil enough for one day. But yet, miraculously, through the power of God and God's provision, the festival candles that they lit burned for 8 days. That is why Hanukkah, the festival of lights, the festival of rededication, that is why there is an 8-night celebration in the Jewish world, because they are remembering the rededication of the temple and the miracle of the provision of God in that moment. And I think John mentions this to really just ground the narrative in a time frame that his readers would have understood.
Mm-hmm.
So the Jewish leaders asked this robust question of, hey, who are you really? Like, if you're the Messiah, just tell us. Like, we'll deal. We'll deal with it if you just tell us.
Why do you think the Jews asked that?
I think that the Jews asked Jesus that because, I mean, not just because of what I said on Sunday, but like the stars are kind of aligning for Jesus to be the Messiah. Like, things are starting to maybe even click a little bit in certain Jewish leaders' minds. And they may have just been so fascinated by him. And like, I think that they're smart people. We have the benefit of 2,000 years of hindsight. I completely grant that. But I don't think you can be so misguided as to completely miss Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there had to have been this little curious subset. In fact, we know there was this little curious subset because Nicodemus came to Jesus, and Nicodemus would have been one of the leaders. And I think that there was this fascination with Jesus in part. I think that they asked that question because they've been looking for the Messiah for so long. And if Jesus really is it, then they have to drop it. They have to stop doing what they're doing. That could be part of it. The other part really could be Jewish leadership was so threatened by Jesus that they could have been baiting him one more time into saying something blasphemous.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they ask, are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, duh, then they've got him.
Mm-hmm.
They've got him. And so Jesus is very calculating in how he answers this question because he says, I have told you. You should have heard this by now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think two of the places where that's made the most plain is first with the woman at the well. Like, she is a Samaritan woman. She should not have been talking to Jesus. Jesus should not have been talking to her. Like, when the disciples come back and realize that Jesus had been talking to her, they are pissed at the entire situation. They're pissed at Jesus. They're pissed at the woman. Everyone's mad because that's how scandalous it was that Jesus was talking to her. And not only was Jesus talking to her, Jesus was debating theology with her.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a sect of Judaism that recognizes, not the Temple Mount, but a different mountain where they worshiped and based their life off of. And they're debating theology. And Jesus is presenting to her a way of salvation. And that would have spread because the woman goes from that encounter into her village and she says, look, y'all know that I'm not, the one that God should be revealing himself to, but yet here I had this experience where Jesus could tell me everything about myself.
Right.
That word would have spread. That teaching would have spread. That fundamental truth that Jesus was speaking. He is the one that can give living water. I mean, no one else can make that claim.
Mm-hmm.
That would have spread. And then the other story in John's gospel where this really becomes plain is with the man born blind in John 9. The disciples completely misunderstand the entire situation because, the disciples. And they say, who sinned so that this one was born blind? And Jesus says, this is so that God's glory can be on display. And he heals the man, and then he's like, out. And the man's like, I don't know really who healed me. I knew his name was Jesus of Nazareth. And over again, he's questioned. His parents are questioned. He's questioned again. And he's just like, what? Do you want to follow this Jesus too? Like, what more do you want from me? And so the word about Jesus would have come to the religious leaders in such a way where they would have known that Jesus has said these things.
Mm-hmm.
But they couldn't listen. They couldn't get it. They couldn't quite grasp it. They weren't quite there. And then Jesus says that, my deeds testify to me too. And so, and those are all over the Gospel of John. One of the things about the Gospel of John is that it is the gospel of signs and miracles. One of the very first things that Jesus physically does in the Gospel of John is turn water into wine.
Mm-hmm.
And the second half of John 4 is a major healing. The signs and the wonders of Jesus are all around him. He heals the man born blind. And in the next chapter of Scripture, we read from John 10 on Sunday. In John 11, Jesus raises Lazarus. And so, the signs that Jesus did testify to who he is in such a way that we can grasp, but they couldn't quite grasp it.
So what do you think? Do you think it was some of both? How the question was based, because it would have been a group of people that came,
Yep.
That Jesus was talking to that asked this question.
Yep.
It had to be some of both camps.
I would think.
Asking the same question, looking for different answers, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah. The way that, the early church spread was among Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
It was Jewish people that finally grasped, oh, hey, this really is the Messiah. This is the one that we should be following. And so I think that there were enough people curious that it could have been that they were just curious.
Right.
What I find interesting is that in the times when the Jewish leadership is trying to trap Jesus, the scriptures tell us they're trying to trap Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And this does not have this.
Sure.
This does not have that distinction. This is simply they are feeling suspenseful about who Jesus is. And they say, quit holding us in suspense, and they ask the question. And Jesus takes the conversation in a different direction. They do not get the answer that they want.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us plainly, and Jesus absolutely does not. I believe that this specific question comes from a place of genuine wonder. So there was a genuine wonder among the Jewish folks, and that wonder has not gone away. In fact, that wonder has grown, because eventually in the history of the church, the disciples start to feel called and led to share their faith openly among Gentile people, which was not Jesus's real mode of operation in his time, because he was very Jewish. And I think that he really sought to bring salvation, and Paul explores this in the book of Romans, really bring salvation first to the people of God, and then we are grafted onto that. But I think that Jesus had us in mind when he was talking about being the good shepherd. So Jesus says in John chapter 10, verses 14 and then following, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. But I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. I have sheep that do not belong to this fold, but they hear my voice. This whole thing, in the end of what comes next, is about who hears Jesus' voice and who doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
The Jewish leaders do not, but yet these other sheep of this other flock, which, the first time I read it, I was just mind blown, because I was just wait, this is a reference to Gentile salvation. And then I went and looked up resources, and yes, this is in fact kind of an allusion to Gentile salvation. Us, that are here, this would not be possible. What we do would not be possible if we were not grafted into the faith in the way that Jesus alludes to here in this passage. We are this other flock, and yet we have still heard and still heed the voice of Jesus. I think that's really interesting.
Okay, so if he only kind of alludes to it here, where in the Bible does the Gentile salvation really come into play?
Yeah. So it's in the book of Acts. There are two things that happen. Philip, he's going along the way, and he hears this Ethiopian eunuch, and if he's Ethiopian, he is obviously not Jewish. He's obviously not from a Hebrew background. Philip hears this eunuch reading from the book of Isaiah. And Philip's like, do you get what you're reading? And the Ethiopian's like, well, no, I don't, but it's interesting. I just wish I had someone that could explain it to me. And that's what Philip does. And at the end of the story, the Ethiopian says, we're passing by a stream right now. Is there anything preventing me from being baptized? And Philip says, no. And he baptizes him. And Peter has a vision where he is told by the voice of God to kill and eat of these animals that have fallen from heaven on a sheet, and they are all animals that are unclean. They are all things that because of his Jewish faith are forbidden of him to eat. And he says as much to the voice of God. He says, I can't because these are unclean. And the voice of God says to him back, nothing I have made is unclean. Nothing that I have made is unclean. Take and eat. Then Peter goes back to Cornelius' house and witnesses to his faith and baptizes Cornelius and his entire household. And he's like, whoa, I am understanding that nothing that God made is unclean. And it's talking about the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. Those are the first two places where it's made definitively plain that Gentile salvation is not only possible, but actually the will of God.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Something we don't usually talk about.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
How's this week coming?
Good.
Is it?
Yeah, this week's the start of the Set Free series. We're going to be talking, because we like to talk about what the cross and what the resurrection means for us in terms of our salvation, which is very, very important. We are saved because of these two major events. And we are forever guided and changed by these two events when it comes to how we believe about the fancy church word is soteriology. But there's another sense where Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection accomplishes something so much more in that it changes how we live. Paul tells the church in Galatia, we are set free. And we don't need to submit to a yoke of slavery once again. That's what the Galatians were doing, and Paul was super pissed about it. Jesus set you free. Do not submit to a yoke of slavery once again. And yet we as people of faith can still look at our faith as a big list of do's and don'ts. And that's just not how it's supposed to be. We are set free by Jesus Christ. We are set free to live our lives in his name and in his ways, but yet still set free to live. God is not this big angry person with a magnifying glass in his hand that's waiting to zap you the second that you screw up. That's not how this works. But yet so often we treat it like it is. Mm-hmm. And so what does it mean for us to be set free to live in the light of Jesus Christ, but set free to live freely in that freedom that we've been given?
Well, I'm looking forward to that. This is going to be fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us on the Cut for Time podcast. And join us again next week for the brand new series that Clay's going to present, or again on the podcast next week.
Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.